Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to realize later you were completely wrong? That's exactly what happened to Emily, a struggling writer who walked into a cafe one afternoon, carrying nothing but hope and a stack of rejection letters. She had no idea that the man sitting just a few tables away would change her life forever. She sat down, nervously flipping through her manuscript, waiting for a chance to pitch her story. But instead of encouragement, she was met with laughter and condescension. The editor she had admired for years barely glanced at her work before pushing it aside. What would you do if your dream was crushed in front of strangers? Would you fight for it, or walk away? Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Emily clutched her manuscript tightly as she stepped into the Sterling Cafe, a place she never imagined herself in. The cafe, known for attracting elite writers and publishers, buzzed with quiet conversations, the clinking of porcelain cups, and the faint scent of fresh espresso in the air. Sunlight filtered through the large glass windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden floors. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here, to meet Richard Thornton, a renowned editor with the power to change her life. She adjusted her coat, feeling out of place among the well-dressed patrons. Around her, men and women in designer outfits sipped their coffee while discussing book deals and literary trends. She could almost hear the whispers, "Who let her in?" Across the cafe, Richard Thornton sat at a corner table, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit. His silver-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he scrolled through his phone, barely acknowledging the waitress who placed an espresso in front of him. Thornton was a man of power, known for his brutal honesty and sharp critiques. If he liked her manuscript, everything could change. If he didn't, she didn't want to think about that. With hesitant steps, Emily approached his table. Her heart pounded as she cleared her throat. "Mr. Thornton? I'm Emily Carter. We spoke over email. You said you'd take a look at my manuscript." He glanced up briefly, his expression neutral, then gestured for her to sit. She did so quickly, placing the thick stack of pages in front of him. For a moment, he said nothing, simply sipping his espresso. Then, with an almost dismissive sigh, he picked up the first page. Silence stretched between them as he skimmed. Emily held her breath, searching his face for any sign of emotion, interest, curiosity, anything. Then, it happened. Thornton chuckled. Not the amused kind, but the kind that made her stomach drop. "This," he said, flicking through the pages without real interest, "is what you've been working on?" Emily swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of her chair. "Yes. I've put everything into it." He leaned back, shaking his head. "You know, I can always tell when someone doesn't have it. You remind me of every desperate writer who thinks passion is enough. This? It's amateur." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had braced herself for criticism, but not for outright humiliation. She felt the sting of judgment, the subtle but undeniable shift in the room. Nearby patrons had begun to glance over, their eyes flickering with curiosity. She started, but he cut her off with a smirk. "Let me guess. You think if I just give it a chance, I'll see the brilliance, right?" He shook his head, tapping the manuscript. "Writing isn't about hope. It's about skill. And this," he pushed the pages toward her, "doesn't have it." Heat rushed to Emily's face. She felt exposed, like a child being scolded in public. A small part of her wanted to argue, to defend herself. But what could she say? This man had built careers. He had seen thousands of manuscripts. And in his eyes, she wasn't even worth a second glance. A few tables away, someone had been watching the entire exchange. A man, dressed simply in a black t-shirt and jeans, sat quietly with a book in hand. Unlike the others, his expression wasn't one of amusement or indifference. It was something else. Understanding. Emily's hands trembled as she gathered her manuscript. "Thank you for your time," she whispered, forcing herself to stand. Thornton didn't even look up as she turned away. And just like that, her last shred of confidence crumbled. Emily gripped the manuscript tightly, her fingers digging into the worn pages as she turned away from Richard Thornton's table. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to walk, to keep her head high. Every step felt heavier under the weight of the stairs that followed her. A soft murmur spread through the cafe like ripples in a pond. A few customers exchanged amused glances, some whispering to each other. Others simply watched with detached curiosity, as if they had just witnessed another failed dreamer being put in their place. At a nearby table, a woman in a pristine white blazer leaned toward her companion. "Did you hear that? She really thought she could impress Thornton with that?" Her companion chuckled, shaking his head. "Aspiring writers are all the same. They think passion is enough. If she were any good, she wouldn't be begging for meetings in a cafe." Emily heard every word. She willed herself not to react, not to let them see the cracks forming in her resolve. She reached the counter, intending to leave, but the waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, gave her a sympathetic look. "Miss, would you like some water?" she offered gently. Emily shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice barely held together. Behind her, Richard Thornton's voice rose again, making sure she, and everyone else, could hear. "You know, I almost feel bad," he said, loud enough to draw even more attention. "But honesty is better than false hope. Someone should tell her now before she wastes more years on a lost cause." The words cut deeper than she expected. It wasn't just a rejection. It was public humiliation. Emily turned back, her jaw tightening. She wanted to say something, anything, but Thornton met her gaze with the confidence of a man who had spoken the truth so many times that he no longer expected to be challenged. A few tables away, the man in the black t-shirt quietly closed his book. He had been watching from the beginning, his expression unreadable. Emily swallowed hard and forced herself to respond, though her voice was quieter than she wanted. "I understand you didn't like it. But that doesn't mean I'm a lost cause." Thornton smirked, amused by her attempt at defiance. "Optimism is charming, but it won't make you a writer. Some people have talent, some don't. That's reality." The whispers grew louder, and Emily felt her own confidence slipping. A younger man at another table, dressed in a sleek designer suit, leaned back in his chair. "Maybe she just needs a reality check. Writing isn't for everyone." Emily turned toward the exit, feeling her throat tighten. Then, a voice cut through the murmurs. "That's funny," the man in the black t-shirt spoke, his tone calm yet carrying weight. "Because some of the greatest writers in history were rejected dozens of times before they found success." The room stilled slightly, surprised that someone had spoken up. Thornton turned toward him with mild interest. "And who are you, exactly?" The man shrugged. "Just someone who's seen a lot of people give up too soon." Emily looked at him properly for the first time. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't quite place it. Thornton scoffed, shaking his head. "Encouraging false hope does more harm than good. A real writer would already have something to show for their work." The man smirked slightly, leaning forward. "Or maybe a real writer is someone who doesn't stop just because one person says no." There was a flicker of recognition in the eyes of one of the baristas. She stared at the man for a long moment, her brow furrowing as if she were trying to place his face. Emily caught it, too. A strange feeling settled in her chest, like she was missing something obvious. Thornton, however, wasn't impressed. He rolled his eyes and turned back to his espresso. "Believe what you want. But the industry doesn't care about dreams, it only cares about results." The man didn't argue. He simply smiled faintly and turned his attention to Emily. What do you think? She hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. Her instinct was to retreat, to let the moment pass, but something about the way he asked made her pause. I think, she took a shaky breath, that I don't want to stop just because someone tells me to. The man's eyes glimmered with something, approval, maybe. But he said nothing, simply nodding as if he already knew she had it in her. Thornton sighed, clearly done with the conversation. Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. Emily turned away, but before she could leave, the man in black spoke again, his voice light but firm. Would you mind if I took a look at your manuscript? Emily blinked in surprise. The cafe had fallen into an expectant hush, the curiosity in the air palpable. Thornton chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Sure, let her believe in miracles. Emily hesitated, glancing at the man again. Who was he? But something told her that this was a moment she couldn't walk away from. Slowly, she placed the manuscript in his hands. Emily hesitated as the man in the black t-shirt took the manuscript from her hands. His fingers brushed against the worn pages, his eyes scanning the first few lines with quiet focus. The cafe, which had been buzzing with murmurs and condescending glances just moments ago, fell into an odd silence. Richard Thornton leaned back in his chair, watching with mild amusement. You really think you'll find something in there? He scoffed. Be my guest. Just don't waste too much of your time. But the man didn't respond. He continued reading, his expression calm, focused. Then, something shifted. A small, knowing smile appeared on his lips. Emily's heart pounded. She didn't understand what was happening, but something about his reaction felt different. A few feet away, the barista who had been watching earlier suddenly gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her eyes widened in shock as she stared at the man. Thornton frowned at the reaction. What's wrong with you? He muttered. The barista ignored him. She grabbed the arm of her coworker, whispering frantically. Within seconds, another staff member turned to look, their faces mirroring the same stunned realization. Emily noticed it too. Around the cafe, a ripple of recognition spread. People were beginning to glance at the man differently, some whispering, some staring outright. Thornton noticed the shift in energy, his smug expression flickering with confusion. What? He scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Who even is this guy? The barista finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't recognize him? Emily's breath caught in her throat. Thornton frowned deeper, impatient. Should I? The barista swallowed hard. That's Keanu Reeves. Silence. Dead, suffocating silence. Thornton blinked, then let out a short laugh. That's ridiculous. He turned to the man, narrowing his eyes. You're saying he's Keanu Reeves? The man finally looked up from Emily's manuscript, his gaze meeting Thornton's directly. And in that moment, the realization hit him like a freight train. The familiar features, the calm demeanor, the piercing yet kind eyes, he had been sitting across from one of the most respected, beloved actors in Hollywood. The same man known not just for his movies, but for his humility, kindness, and deep appreciation for storytelling. Thornton's face drained of color. The rest of the cafe erupted in whispers. Is it really him? Oh my God, it is Keanu Reeves. What is he doing here? Emily, still frozen in shock, looked at the manuscript now in his hands. Her heart pounded as Keanu flipped through the pages again, nodding to himself. This, Keanu said finally, tapping the manuscript, is actually really good. Thornton's mouth fell open slightly. Keanu leaned forward, his tone thoughtful. It's raw. It needs work, sure. But it has something real. Something worth refining. He set the manuscript down and met Emily's wide-eyed stare. Have you ever considered writing for film? Emily's breath caught in her throat. No. I never thought I'd get the chance. Keanu smiled. Well, maybe it's time someone gave you one. Thornton's fingers twitched as he stared between Keanu and Emily. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something else, regret. Panic. I didn't know, Thornton stammered, scrambling to recover. I mean, I wasn't saying she had no potential. Just that. Keanu raised a brow, waiting. Thornton cleared his throat, suddenly looking much smaller in his expensive suit. I was just trying to be honest. Constructive. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then, with a slow nod, he simply said, honesty is important. But so is knowing when to listen. Thornton swallowed hard, looking away. The cafe, once filled with quiet scorn toward Emily, now watched her with a new kind of curiosity, admiration even. The power dynamic had flipped completely. And Emily? She wasn't just standing there anymore. She was standing taller. A heavy silence hung over the cafe. Richard Thornton, the once confident and untouchable editor, now looked like a man who had miscalculated the weight of his own words. His gaze flickered between Emily and Keanu, as if searching for a way to undo the damage. Emily could feel the shift in the room, where once she had been the subject of ridicule, now she stood in an entirely different light. But instead of gloating, she took a deep breath and centered herself. She had a choice. She could humiliate Thornton the way he had humiliated her. She could remind him of every cruel word he had said. But that wouldn't make her any stronger, it would only make her like him. Instead, she spoke with calm clarity. I appreciate honesty, Mr. Thornton, she said, meeting his eyes. Writers need tough feedback. But there's a difference between constructive criticism and tearing someone down just because you can. Thornton shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to speak, but for once, he had no sharp words to throw. Keanu, still seated, watched with quiet approval. Emily continued, her voice steady. I came here hoping for a chance. Not to be handed success, just for someone to see me, to see my work. You didn't. And that's okay. But maybe next time, you'll remember that words have power. Thornton let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. The arrogance had drained from him completely. He looked around, noticing the quiet judgment in the eyes of those who had witnessed everything. I was wrong, he admitted, the words coming out slower than his usual confident remarks. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. Emily didn't answer right away. Forgiveness wasn't something to be given just because someone felt guilty, it had to mean something. So instead, she nodded. Not a full absolution, but an acknowledgement that growth was possible. Thornton hesitated, then reached for the manuscript. He picked it up carefully, running his fingers over the pages he had once dismissed. I'd like to take another look at this, he said, his voice quieter now. If you'd be willing. Emily thought for a moment. Then, with a small smile, she said, I think I'll be just fine without your validation. A flicker of something crossed Thornton's face, maybe a mix of humility and respect. He gave a small nod, accepting her decision. Keanu stood up, handing the manuscript back to Emily. I meant what I said, he told her. You have something special. If you ever want to explore screenwriting, I'd be happy to introduce you to the right people. Emily's chest tightened. Was this really happening? A door she had never even considered was opening right in front of her. I would love that, she said, trying to keep her emotions in check. Keanu smiled. Then let's make it happen. As Emily clutched her manuscript, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about proving Thornton wrong. It was about knowing that her journey didn't end here. She turned toward the door, walking away, not defeated, but stronger. As Emily stepped outside the cafe, manuscript clutched tightly in her hands, she took a deep breath. The cool afternoon air felt different now, lighter, filled with possibility. She walked a few steps down the sidewalk, still processing everything when a small voice called out behind her. "Excuse me, miss?" She turned to see a young girl, no older than 10, standing beside the cafe entrance. Her curly brown hair was tied in 2 braids, and she held a small notebook in her hands. Emily smiled gently. "Hey there. What's up?" The girl hesitated, then looked down at her notebook. "I saw what happened in there," she said softly. "And I just wanted to say, I really liked how you didn't give up." Emily's heart warmed. She crouched down to meet the girl's eyes. "Thank you. That means a lot." The girl bit her lip before holding out the notebook. I like writing too. But I get scared to show people my stories. What if they laugh at me?" Emily's chest tightened at the familiar fear. She glanced at the notebook's worn cover, the little doodles on the edges, the careful way the girl held it, like it was something precious. She reached into her own bag and pulled out a pen. Carefully, she opened the first page and wrote a few words before handing it back. The girl looked down, reading Emily's message. "A writer is just someone who refuses to stop. Keep going. The world needs your stories." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really?" Emily nodded. "Really. No one gets to decide your worth but you." The girl grinned, hugging the notebook close. "Thank you." She turned and ran back toward her mother, who had been watching from a few feet away with a knowing smile. Emily exhaled, standing up. Just as she turned, she caught a glimpse of Richard Thornton still inside the cafe. He sat alone now, staring at his untouched espresso. But what caught her attention wasn't his usual arrogance, it was the way his expression softened as he watched the exchange. For the first time, his gaze wasn't filled with judgment. It was something else. Reflection. Maybe people could change. Maybe some lessons took longer to sink in. Emily smiled to herself, then turned back to the street. She had a new chapter to write. As Emily walked away from the cafe, she felt lighter, not because the weight of rejection had disappeared, but because she finally understood that one person's opinion didn't define her. She had spent years believing she needed validation from people like Richard Thornton to be worthy. But today, she had learned something far more valuable. True success wasn't about immediate recognition, it was about persistence. About believing in yourself even when no one else does. Behind her, Richard Thornton remained seated at his table, staring into his untouched espresso. He wasn't the same man who had mocked her earlier. There was no smugness, no dismissive arrogance, only quiet reflection. Perhaps he saw a version of himself in her, the ambition, the hunger, the raw passion. Perhaps, for the first time in a long time, he realized how many voices he had silenced before they ever had the chance to grow. Emily didn't need his approval anymore. But maybe, just maybe, he would think twice before crushing someone else's dreams. As she turned the corner, the words Keanu Reeves had said echoed in her mind. "Have you ever considered writing for film?" She smiled to herself. A door she never even imagined was now open. Not because she begged for it, but because she refused to stop knocking. To anyone watching, the lesson was clear. Rejection is not the end. The world may not recognize your worth immediately, but that doesn't mean you're not worthy. Keep going, keep creating, because the only real failure is giving up on yourself. And with that, Emily stepped into her next chapter. Not waiting for permission, but writing her own story.